Hello and welcome to the Wild Side with your host Kight. That was Dido singing White Flag. And her song title has introduced the theme of today, which is coloration. And I was inspired by this dreary autumn that has set in. So suddenly we have gray weather and rainy skies and all of the leaves are turning color. And I thought maybe it was time to inject a bit of excitement into the color scheme of these recent days. And so we're going to discuss the coloration and also the patterning of animals. Now this is a topic that's been of interest to researchers for a really long time because it's just something that's quite obvious. You can't help but see all of the fantastic hues of different animals and wonder what it is that produces these and what they're used for, and how in fact some animals can survive given that some of their coloration is just really obvious and fantastic, and you think that it might be actually difficult for them, a burden for them to bear. And in fact, one of the early-ish writers of coloration literature is Darwin, who actually wrote about coloration in The Origin of Species, because he recognized that there must have been some kind of evolutionary reason why animals would have the colors that they have, given the environments that they live in and the lifestyles that they have. So coloration results from the reflection or emission of light from a surface. And there's obviously a whole lot of physics involved in how light is transmitted through the environment, and also how our eyes pick up light and the eyes of other animals pick up light and then see different types of colors. And I'm not going to go into that today because that's a lot of heavy detail, and it's actually, eyes are very complex, and it's not easy to sit and talk about that within an hour or even many different hours. So instead I'm going to kind of step back a little bit and focus on the bigger picture a bit. So just assuming we already kind of know that yes, light is transmitted and eyes pick these up, these different colors up, what are some of the things we might want to know about coloration? Well, one thing is what it is that produces the different types of color that we see, because you know that light is all colors, and so only some of those are the things that we actually perceive. So pigments, for example, are substances that are produced by animals or are picked up by animals from the environment that absorb some wavelengths of that white light but then reflect others. And so the ones that are reflected are the ones that we are then, the colors that we're going to perceive. And when you have a pigment, regardless of what angle you're looking at an object from, you're going to see the same color. And there are many different types of pigment families in animals, and these include carotenoids, which show up as yellow and orange or red or pink, melanins, which show up as browns and blacks, luciferin, which is a light-emitting coloration that we'll talk about later on, for instance, involved in jellyfish, and also rhodopsin, which is an important photopigment that is actually what allows us, or one of the things that allows us to perceive light. Now, chromatophores are another important thing to know about because these are pigment-containing cells that can shuttle different pigments around to different parts of their cell and redirect reflective plates on the surface of the cell in order to broadcast different colors. And basically, animals can have anywhere from one to several layers of these, and they can move pigments into and out of these in order to broadcast different colors. And if you've got several different layers, and each layer contains different colors, then you can clear out pigments from top layers in order to allow your receivers of the signal to peer down into the second, third, fourth, whatever layers. And this allows you to then move around colors very quickly and go through lots of different colors. And that's what we have, that's what allows the coloration changes that we see in things like chameleons and jellyfish and squid and all these types of animals that can rapidly go from one color to another in order to match their environment or show that they're angry, for example. And actually, chromatophores they're also found in a bit more boring circumstances, I guess. So also just regular skin coloration in things like fish and frogs, and actually lots of different mammals. They can be responsible for the coloration in eyes. So it's not just these kind of magical looking changes of color, but also just the color that you see on an everyday basis. And chromatophores, actually, there are different types of them depending on the color of pigment that they contain. So for example, you have cyanophores, which contain cyan, so blue. You've got melanophores, which contain kind of black-brown coloration. Leucophores, so if you know all of your Greek and Latin roots, you're going to recognize these. Leuco indicates white, so leucophores are whitish, and so on and so forth. Now, pigments aren't the only things that are responsible for color. Another really important thing to understand is structural coloration. And basically, what you have here is changes in the microstructure of surfaces that interfere with the way that light is reflected and refracted. So this is actually a really complex process, and again, this involves quite a bit of physics, and I'm not going to go into really heavy detail here because that's just too much to talk about in one day. Also, I'm not a physicist, and so I'd better not venture into that territory. But basically the idea is that if you have kind of a crystal structure or a particular angle, and often these microstructures involve lots of different angles, and so the light hits these and scatters off in different directions, and it changes what would otherwise be perceived. So in particular, you find that blues and greens tend to result from microstructure, and this is particularly true in birds and insects. So for example, peacock tail feathers are actually brown, but because of their microstructure, they appear to be kind of bluish and green, and they have iridescence. And iridescence results from the fact that there is scattering in all sorts of different directions at once. So if you change your angle a little bit, you're going to see a different type of scatter than if you were at a different angle. And so that's why you might see kind of a change from blue to green to purple and all sorts of different shades. And that's responsible for the coloration that you see on lots of blackbirds that tend to have those iridescent patterns as well. So things like magpies, for example, and many crows and grackles and that sort of thing. Now, microstructure is also responsible for, there are different types of microstructures that are responsible for all of this iridescence. And that includes things called diffraction grating. So that's when you have lots of layers of chitin and air, and you see that in butterfly wings. Selective mirrors, which are bowl-shaped pits that are filled again with chitin, and that's something you also see in butterflies. So butterflies pop up a lot here because there's quite a lot of iridescence in butterfly coloration. There's something else called photonic crystals, and these are different orientations of lattices or holes. And so you'll have a little patch that all have the same orientation, but then there are alternating patches that have different orientations. And so just depending on what kind of patch you're aligned with, you're going to see a different type of color emerging from the wings of the butterfly. Another example is something called a crystal fiber, and this is kind of what I was referring to when I said there were lots of different directions at once. So these are tiny hollow fibers that are hexagonal, and so each fiber has 6 different directions in which it'll spin off light after the light hits it. And one organism called the sea mouse is actually something that's considered one of the most iridescent of all marine organisms, and that's because it has these crystal fibers that amplify basically all of the light that it's exploding off of its surface. And you actually see a similar effect resulting from something called a deformed matrix, and that's a randomly oriented group of nanochannels. So you have the same kind of thing where you've got these little patches of things that have multiple different surfaces and that they reflect light in different directions at once. So microstructure is really exciting. An exciting thing to study because it is so dynamic and there's so many different types of things going on, and it produces just really fantastic colors that look really impressive and quite different in person than if you're looking at a sample in a laboratory. So actually researchers that study these have to be quite careful with the way that they are examining these samples under the light or under the microscope, because if you're trying to measure, for example, the color of an animal in the wild, you have to make sure that you've aligned all of these things in the right direction so that it actually mimics the way the animal looks in the wild. Otherwise, what you're looking at might not actually reflect, no pun intended, what's actually happening out in nature. So the last thing that I want to mention as a kind of a source, something that causes coloration, is bioluminescence. And this is a little bit different because this is not just color, but actually all colors in general. So you've got the production and emission of light itself. which results from, basically it's just energy. So it happens to be light energy instead of heat energy, and that happens because there is a chemical reaction that these animals produce. So as I mentioned earlier, this involves lucerne, which is a pigment, but it also involves luciferase, which is an enzyme. So what happens is that luciferin reacts with, sorry, I can't speak today. Luciferin reacts with oxygen, and that produces the light. And this reaction is catalyzed by the presence of luciferase. And you have to have, or it's quite a good idea to have the catalysis, because if you had something that was just going to chemically react all the time by itself as soon as oxygen hit it, then you could have quite an unstable circumstance. And so it's best to have an enzyme involved, so that means that you're only going to produce the coloration, the light, whenever you want to, whenever you allow that enzyme to be released and mix in with the luciferin. And this is something that's found actually in both vertebrates and invertebrates. It's not the most common of things, certainly not as common as coloration, but it's in a surprising number of organisms. And that includes microorganisms, terrestrial animals, and marine organisms. And really well-known examples of this include fireflies, glowworms, some fungi actually, anglerfish, which I've talked about before on the show, and other things such as corals and jellyfish and dinoflagellates. So yes, it is particularly common in marine environments where there's not a whole light penetrating all by itself, and so animals do quite well to generate their own light. That was Blue Hotel by Chris Isaak, and you are listening to The Wild Side on Source FM. And during the break, I got a very supportive message from a listener, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you. If you'd included your name, I would have given you a shout out. So anyone else who wants to send in any messages, hopefully nice ones, I will mention you live on air. And thank you very much, and keep them coming in, guys. So we were talking today about coloration, and just before the break I was talking about the different sources of coloration. Well, why is it that animals, regardless of source, why do they have the coloration that they do? Well, evolutionarily speaking, as I mentioned earlier, this was recognized by Darwin. Basically, particular color patterns are going to allow animals to survive and or reproduce better than other color patterns in their particular environment and given their particular life histories. And this can happen because of a number of reasons. For instance, certain color patterns can increase safety, for example by allowing you to hide better, to broadcast the message that you're dangerous or unpalatable, and basically to encourage predators and other attackers to leave you alone. It can make you attractive to other individuals, so that's kind of the opposite of the previous point. This could be sexually attractive, or it could encourage friendships, if you will. So between animals, for example, that have mutualistic relationships and want to find someone to hang out with and to work together towards a common goal with. That's obviously very anthropomorphic, but I think you understand my meaning. And also physical protection. So in humans, a great example of this is protection from sunburn. And obviously one of the big reasons that we have lots of different shades of skin is that it protects us from sunburn, and we're not the only ones that display this kind of thing. And also it can be totally accidental. So for instance, if you have see-through skin that happens to show your red blood, you're probably not broadcasting that red coloration for a particular reason. It's just a byproduct of the fact that you have see-through skin. So what are the different types of color and pattern that we see? And these are basically arranged here and kind of to discuss each one of these categories in a bit more detail. So first I'll start off by talking about the kind of patterns and colors that are used to make yourself harder to see. So one very obvious example of this is camouflage. And camouflage is basically a method of concealment that allows otherwise visible organisms to remain unnoticed by either blending in with the habitat or appearing to be something else altogether that's not going to be interesting to other organisms. And there are different types of camouflage. So one of these is mimesis, and it's also called masquerade. And in this circumstance, you've got the entire animal imitating the appearance of another object that's not very interesting. So this is something that you especially see in prey animals that want to remain unnoticed by their predators. And a great example of this is the peppered moth caterpillar, which completely mimics a twig. So its coloration and its patterning are appropriate for looking like a twig, and then also its posture. So when it's approached, it will stand upright and remain very rigid, and it looks like something that's just an outgrowth of whatever branch it's sitting on. Another great example is a stick bug, which looks quite obviously like sticks. Flounder, so for example the peacock flounder can change colors and they'll look just like the substrate. So you can be looking down at the sand or down at the rocks on the bottom of the ocean and you won't even notice that there's a flounder there because it looks just like it's part of that substrate. Something else that I've actually seen in person is the green vine snake, and this can look quite a lot like plant vines, and so if you're walking along it can be very easy to dismiss the snake because it just looks like a part of the floral material, when in fact it is actually a live animal. So as you might expect, kind of given the example that that's a snake, this is something that also can be quite useful for predators or for parasites if they want to lure in prey or kind of create a false sense of security in prey. And this is something we've seen, for instance, in flower mantis, which mimics different flowers, in particular orchids, and so it will have prey that approach it unknowing. So insects, bees in particular, and flies will go to get the nectar, and they won't even realize that actually they're approaching a mantis and not a flower. Another great example, a bit closer to home, is the common cuckoo, where females will mimic sparrowhawks. And this gives the female time to finish her egg laying before a host bird will return and see the nest contents, because the host bird is off demonstrating and trying to get help and to come in and have someone chase off this hawk with her. And it gives the cuckoo enough time to get in there and lay her eggs before anyone realizes that actually this wasn't a hawk at all. And then of course the baby cuckoos will then mimic the host young. So here you have mimicry at all stages of the life cycle. Another example of camouflage is crypsis, and this is something that's particularly common in human culture, because it's something that we do in the military. So this is when you want to blend in with the background. And you can do that by doing lots of different things. One really obvious example is resembling the background color and or texture, and that's the kind of thing that we see with kind of the army fatigues or the painting on army vehicles. And in nature, an example of this is the adult version of that peppered moth caterpillar. So it turns into a moth, and the moth blends in with tree bark. So obviously, throughout their life histories, these animals are spending a lot of time on trees, and so they just kind of change what part of the tree they look like at different periods of their lives. Something else you can do is use disruptive patterning, such as spots or stripes, to break up your outline. Obviously, if you are sitting there with your human-shaped outline or your mouse-shaped outline or whatever you are, that's going to be quite an obvious thing against a background of an open sky in particular, but even something a bit more complex like leaves or trees. And so if you can break up your outline and break up your body shape so that it kind of fits in with the shadowing and the lighting of a particular environment, then you're going to be a lot less obvious, even if you aren't completely hidden. So here's a circumstance in which you want to have high contrast, light areas and dark patches, and it's going to be non-repetitive. So basically it just doesn't have any really obvious characteristic that a predator or an attacker could key in on. And it just disrupts the recognizable shape or orientation of an animal. And this is used by both predators and prey both. So leopards, for example, are notoriously hard to see. In fact, I actually saw a leopard on safari in Africa, and I was staring right at it for the longest time before I realized what it was. It's amazing how close you can be and see these things, but not really see them because they are just blending in so well. Another example, which I also have experience with, is nightjars. And nightjars look pretty much completely like bark. And no matter where they're sitting, so they're not mimicking bark, I'm just kind of giving you that as a description. No matter where they're sitting, they just kind of look completely nondescript, and often they'll come out and sit along the side of the road, like if there's a ledge, they'll come line up on the ledge and then jump off of there in order to go capture some prey at night. And they will completely blend in, and the only way that you can see them is to try to get light shining in their eyes so that you can see their eyes shine, because it's practically impossible to actually see their bodies appearing out of the habitat. So another example of something that you might do in order to blend in is to eliminate your shadow. Just like having a particular outline or particular shape, it's a really bad idea to have a quite obvious shadow, because that means it's going to emphasize your outline. It's going to be a big, bold, dark line right around you or underneath you, and that's going to be a dead giveaway that you're there. And one way that you can eliminate your shadow is to be quite low and close to the ground, and also to taper your edges so that they kind of ease into the ground really subtly and just completely keep you flat, so that the sun is not going to cause this really, well, any lighting source, it's not going to cause a really obvious big shadow. So in North America, there are horned lizards that have very flat bodies, and they have tapered edges, and their side scales are also fringed, which means that even where there is a shadow, the shadow is not regular, it's kind of patchy and wavy, and so it looks like, you know, just rocks on the ground or any sort of irregular patterning. And researchers are pretty sure that's why these lizards have all of these different characteristics, because very closely related lizards that live in completely different habitats lack all of these things. And so it does seem to be very much a case of these lizards needing to blend in their particular habitat, which is completely open and sunny and offers really no protection other than to just be really camouflaged. Something else I mentioned earlier is changing your skin pattern or your color. And this is something that's actually a famous characteristic of many different species, such as chameleons and squid and octopi, as I mentioned. However, you do also see them in things like amphibians, fish, reptiles, crustaceans, all sorts of different cephalopods, not just the ones I mentioned, and even bacteria. And as I said, you can, with chromatophores, you can quickly shuttle the pigments in and out and move them in different locations in order to have a different coloration at any given time. However, you do also sometimes see longer-term changes in color, and these are not associated with chromatophores, but instead with, most of the time, completely replacing your plumage or your pelt or whatever type of covering you have. It can also just be your whole skin, with a brand new version. And this is also something that we see in relation to age. So obviously as you age, in humans we have hair going whiter and skin kind of changing, maybe becoming spotty. But a lot of times in animals we see this happening because of weather. So hares and foxes and stoats, ptarmigans, all these kind of northern animals that live in kind of places that are brownish or grayish in the summer, so they're hiding in rocks, they're hiding on the ground. They want to be dark in the summer, but then once the snow falls in the winter, they need to be able to blend in, and so then they shed or molt or whatever the right term would be, depending on the species, in order to have white coloration for the winter.